where we stopped last time. We were talking about the Northern Song dynasty, this period of great sophistication. The Song is really China's most sophisticated art. And it's a period I think I mentioned last time that the Chinese don't look back on very positively, and we'll find out why that is today. Certainly the most famous object from certainly the Northern Song period anyway, is our very famous local hero of Kuan Yin in the Nelson Gallery. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with that room, the wonderful space that you go into. And they've placed it within the walls of a Chinese temple, but the temple walls behind it don't really relate to this figure. They're actually much later. They're 14th century wall paintings, but they wanted to sort of create the mood or recreate the mood. And I think they've done a wonderful job of it with the lighting and the sounds, the way the sound echoes and reverberates in that space is very much like the interior of a shrine room or a temple. We've encountered Kuan Yin before with his Sanskrit name, Avalokiteshvara, who is the most important bodhisattva, the bodhisattva of infinite compassion. Kuan Yin is simply his Chinese name. He has different names in every country. He's Chenrezig in Tibet, Kannon we'll see in Japan, Kwanon in Korea, but his most difficult name is his original name. The other names are all much easier. Certainly Kuan Yin is a lot easier than Avalokiteshvara. Stories about Kuan Yin come from various sutras. In the Nelson Gallery, they usually refer to this as the seated Kuan Yin of the Southern Sea, and it relates to these sort of pile of rocky outcropping that he's supposedly sitting on that relates to his hypothetical home at Mount Podalaka in the Southern Sea. And the Southern Sea, they're referring to the South China Sea, which has these incredible rocks that protrude from the water. They're in movies all the time. If you watch many movies, you'll see these incredible scene of water with these tall vertical rock forms that jut straight up. They're probably filming in the South China Sea, and that's where this is supposedly taking place. The figure is a little over life size, or actually quite a bit over life size. He's about 8 foot, and he's seated, so he'd be taller than that standing. It's made out of wood, not a single piece of wood, several pieces of wood that have been joined and then polychromed, or in other words, painted, which is why he's in such good shape. It really is the finest, I think, the finest example of Kuan Yin. Metropolitan has this much smaller, and I don't think anywhere near as good, a version of seated Kuan Yin, and they always claim this is the best one, which it totally isn't. If you just look at it, it's obvious ours is the best one. And also its condition is very important. He is seated in what's called royal ease. He's dressed as a prince, which we know is not uncommon because that symbolism, it has a couple of symbols. Being dressed like a prince, like most bodhisattvas. Shakyamuni himself, before he became enlightened, was a prince, and so it symbolizes that, but it also symbolizes someone who's right on the verge of enlightenment. It's sort of a highly evolved figure is what princely garb usually signifies. He's depicted now in a very Chinese style, very kind of soft, sometimes for Western eyes, it looks slightly effeminate, but not compared to Indian art by any means. And that's really just the style. Because he is a bodhisattva and really doesn't exist in the physical world, he can take many forms, and like a lot of other figures, has multiple avatars, forms that he can appear in, and one of them is as the so-called goddess of mercy, which is a female form, and you really see Kuan Yin as the goddess of mercy only in China and only for a few hundred years. It actually begins right about this period is where you start seeing the goddess of mercy. But I have never seen a large figure of the goddess of mercy. They tend to only just be small. They're not large as you would find in a temple, for example. But there is female. It bothers me when I look up something to read about Kuan Yin, and all it says is first line, Kuan Yin is the goddess of mercy. Well, no, Kuan Yin is not. That's one of his many avatars. But if you're really just talking about Kuan Yin, that's a male figure. And everywhere but China is only ever depicted as male. It's beautifully cut, deep undercuttings, beautiful folds of the fabric. That royal ease pose, it's called royal ease because it was associated with kings. It's when you're sitting casually. It's meant to suggest someone is not being very official and formal, but it's very casual, relaxed, and approachable. For a king, for example, it would symbolize you can now approach the king if you have a question. So the pose alone functions to make the figure accessible, or at least that's what it's meant to signify. If the Sung is the most sophisticated, then the Sung ceramics are going to be the most sophisticated ceramics in the history of Chinese ceramics. This is a beautiful little vase. It's called a roux-ware vase. Roux refers to the kiln in which it was made. Often with the name of a vase, it'll have just a single syllable like that. That's almost always a short version of the kiln side. It's Ruzhou is where it was made, so they call it roux-ware. The reference to guan means official or imperial ware. Now, so this would have been made for the imperial court. And that identifies it as such. Beautiful celadon glaze. Now this is porcelain. We know that porcelain like this began in the Tang dynasty, and we saw a beautiful celadon. It's really perfected now. In the northern Sung, while the capital is in the north, true porcelain is still somewhat rare because that was an area that was largely deforested and they didn't have a lot of wood. And so what they did use the wood for, wood kilns, was only really for special ceramics like guanware, like something for the emperor himself, because coal fires didn't get hot enough. So that makes this porcelain very, very rare. It is a celadon. It's that beautiful sort of transparent glaze. You can see there is crazing in here, and I didn't put the term down. I don't know if I put it anywhere else, but crazing, C-R-A-Z, Y-I-N-G, crazing is the sort of little crackles that you see in the glaze. That's intentional. And it's when you put this viscous glaze on very thick and then put it in the kiln, when it cools, it creates these beautiful little crazing marks all over it, and that's highly valued as a design. So those little crackle lines, it's not a mistake. Sometimes it can look accidental or something that happened like later over time, but it's not. It was designed to be that way. And this is another popular style from a different kiln, Dingzhou kiln. It's still that site, a similar site in the north. The north is not really the center of ceramics. That's in the south, and so we'll see better work when they move south. Beautiful bowl like this with a sort of pressed or engraved design in the bowl. It's beautiful white design. So it's true porcelain as well. So very, very subtle. Vases like this are very much about the subtleties of the shape. There's no image on it, no design on it. It's all about the subtleties of the form, the sort of plasticity of the clay, the bulging of the form in relation to the length of the neck, and just finding those perfect proportions and the perfect balance of all of the parts. It's very subtle and really takes a sophisticated court really to appreciate the subtleties that we see here. When you bring in decoration, you see that the shape itself becomes less subtle and less sophisticated. In this case, it's more about the design that's pressed into the clay before it's put into the kiln. Now, in 1126, some people from the north, the Jurchen people, pushed south The north is always the threat in China. That's where danger always comes from, in the north. And you can see where it plays out in things like feng shui, where buildings are placed so their back is to what they call the evil north. So the north has a sort of threatening quality in China. As the Jurchen people press south, this was the old northern Sung capital. They completely control that area, and the court flees south and everyone with them down to Hangzhou. And now they're in a different region. And so we call this the Southern Sung dynasty for that reason. This was a period of great insecurity, and really took the form of a lot of escapism in Chinese art. The Southern court is more romantic in many ways. They're in their art, they're going to replace the literal. When we looked at the Northern Sung court, and I'll remind you of this in a minute, we saw that the court in the north preferred what was called the literal style. Things were very accurate, looking at the world in great detail. But because of the more romantic style in the south, the court will prefer what is called the lyrical mode, and lyrical implying something more poetic, something more ephemeral. And you see it here. This is a sort of a perfect example of a Southern Sung style. It's very different from anything else we have seen in a Chinese painting style, other than the fact that it's still ink wash. It's still basically using washes with ink rather than color, and line is important. It's not symmetrical, it's not balanced. In fact, it's sometimes called a corner composition, because your eye enters down here in the corner, and then you're led back in diagonals through space. Ma Yuan was a very successful court painter during this period. We have a traveling scholar, people who are typically on the road with a servant there. He's holding a zither. He was a musician as well. The strange shape and design, it was originally a fan. So that sort of oval shape was the shape of a fan you would hold. But at some point, the image, the silk was removed from the fan and mounted on paper as an album leaf. So that's why it has this strange shape and this sort of white rectangle design. So it's been remounted. He was known, they're still calligraphers. Painters are still calligraphers at this time. And Ma Yuan was noted for what was called the axe cut stroke. And you can see it in a lot of these. It's sort of a sharp mark. This is very not Chinese. In fact, as we're going to be finding out in just 2 or 3 weeks, this is much more of what I would think of as a Japanese design or a Japanese style rather than Chinese. And in fact, it's so much a Japanese aesthetic that the Japanese have largely started buying up all of the Sung art. The Chinese didn't want it, they didn't care for it, and so much of this stuff is in Japan today. And I'll bring this back and remind you when we look at Japanese art and see the strong, angular, abstract lines of the trees. I mean, that's very Japanese. The asymmetry of it is very Japanese, and therefore quite different from what we would see in China. Chan Buddhism, Zen or Chan Buddhism, popular during this period, but because in Chan art, they largely rejected texts and storytelling and ritual and all of that, we don't find under Chan influence images of Buddhas or anything like that, bodhisattvas. What we find in Chan influence art is scenes like this, which depicts the 6th Chan patriarch at the time of his enlightenment. They like to depict either monks or the patriarchs, who's basically the leader, the head figure at the time. This by Liang Kai. supposedly the patriarch reached enlightenment while he was chopping bamboo. And that's very much a Chan thing. The Chan is the only sort of sect of Buddhism that believes in sort of instantaneous enlightenment, that it's not something you have to work your whole life for. At any moment, you could have this insight and become instantly enlightened. You know, they call these little moments satori, as I mentioned before. That's also very Japanese, where Chan as Zen will become much bigger than it really was in China. And to parallel that, we call it the spontaneous mode. So it has that sense of immediacy. It looks like it was done quickly. It's sort of instantaneous, like a few marks, boop, 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 and there's the painting. And that parallels the Chan sensibility of sort of the instantaneous nature of enlightenment. So the spontaneous mode, very, very simple, very, very quick, again, to parallel what we would expect. And again, this will be very influential in Japan as well. And just reviewing those 4 modes that come out of the song, in the north, we saw the court, they like the literal mode, the bird and flower design. We're going to see more of that subject, but done in great detail and great accuracy. Remember, that was actually painted by the emperor, the second to the last Northern Song emperor actually painted that, but the literati rejected that, the color and the literalness of it, in favor of various things, including landscape images, which were new during this period in the monumental mode. So we saw the earliest literati beginning in the Song, and they were oppositional, but really only oppositional to the style of court painters. It wasn't a political thing at that time. And then in the South, we get that now the court painters prefer the lyrical mode, and literati are actually working in both. There's really not that much difference between the literati and the court art in the Southern Song. They all like all of these things equally. Now, once we get outside the Song, we don't really break painting down that specifically into modes. That's really a Song thing. And all 4 of these modes are going to be influential. Later painting, you know, some parts of it are lyrical, you see monumental, sort of all these things are going to continue, but they're not going to be like purely divided into separate little pigeonholes the way they were. So Song is influential. Now that they've moved south, and have access to the great kiln sites like Jingdezhen, which is the greatest kiln site, and Longshuan, we're going to really see ceramics industry taking off to a great extent. The court taste is equally sophisticated. Now in the South, they're moving to an area where there's a lot more wood available. It's not a deforested area. It's easier to have wood kilns that can burn hot enough to make porcelain, so it's not as rare, but it actually becomes even more sophisticated. We have, the Nelson has a couple of really beautiful, rare Song vases in glass cases. They're in the room right outside where Kuan Yin figure is. There's a bunch of Tang ceramics in the hallway, but when you go into that room, there's some glass cases that are literally facing where the Kuan Yin figure is, and that's where these beautiful, there's some more Tang in there, but some beautiful Song vases. This is Southern Song, which is its most sensitive. This is a small, about 7 inches high. This beautiful design and image. When we compare it to the Northern Song, it's actually goes even a step further. It makes the Northern Song vase look clumsy. The Southern Song uses a really, really thick glaze to create this almost matte surface, again with this beautiful proportions. It has better proportions to my eye than the Northern Song does. It's a more subtle proportions there, but that thicker glaze and a thinner body, there's something about it that's so extremely delicate. You know, it's like an eggshell. You just feel like it's going to break, which is one reason why they are so rare. I mean, they're old, but they are also very, very delicate with this beautiful thin body. This is Southern Song sensibility at its height. Other sorts of things from the period. This is stoneware now. It's not porcelain. Covered funerary jar. There are more of these. There are a lot of these. In fact, there's one very much like this in the Nelson Gallery. It's almost identical. The little figures that you see, those were made by hand in clay and then sort of attached to the surface. It also has a very thick glaze, a very thick celadon glaze. And there are more of these available. Again, it's very thick, viscous. This kind of glaze actually has thousands of tiny, tiny little bubbles directly under the surface that create this surface. You really can't see the bubbles, but they are there. And it's typical of a Longxuan ware as opposed to Jingdezhen ware. But I want to show you a couple of other styles of bowls, or beautiful bowls that come out of this period. Tea bowl, Jianware, again, relating to where it was. This is the oil spot glaze, as it's called, for fairly obvious reasons. This beautiful tea bowl, if you can imagine, if the inside of a tea bowl is just as important as the outside, in many ways it's more important because you're holding it in your hands like this and you're seeing it as you drink the tea. So how it relates to the look of the tea, and the tea, matcha tea, has lots of bubbles and things in it, and this would sort of reflect those, would be really quite beautiful as a design, but simpler ware as well. And I want to point these out. The one on the left, the beautiful hare's fur glaze, reminded people of fur, but also very, very simple peasant ware like this. This is known as temoku ware because it was brought to Japan by traveling Chinese monks. These monks were from Tianmushan Monastery, but the Japanese couldn't pronounce it. So they just called it Temoku because they couldn't pronounce the name of the Chinese monastery. So it's just become known as Temoku ware even in China. But it's a simple, plain peasant ware. And that's what monks wanted. I mean, it's the court that wants those beautiful porcelain pieces, really simple, humble ware like this is what monks would want, and certainly what is going to influence Japanese ceramics, which is obviously going to be extremely different from what we see in China. Okay, the Song dynasty will end fairly abruptly, and it will be ended by some people we've already met, and that is the Mongols. We encountered them in India. We're going back in time, and we're encountering them in China. Now, this is one of the main reasons why the Chinese really look down on the Song dynasties, because they failed. They were so involved with the emperors were artists and painters and so sophisticated that they were paying all their attention to the arts and all of this, and they weren't doing their job, and they were weak. That sophistication of the Song will be interpreted as weakness by later Chinese, and that weakness is going to be blamed for the fall of China to the Mongol Empire. Now, it's questionable whether anyone in power could have stopped the Mongols, but that's really not the point. They could blame the Song. So it's seen as weak. Song art is rejected, so they sell it off really cheap to the Japanese, who really want it all anyway. So that worked out well for everyone. So we've already talked about the Khanates and all of this. Genghis Khan, 1206, and then 1279, the key year when China itself falls to his grandson, Kublai Khan, who becomes the first emperor of the Yuan dynasty. Dynasty names at this point are chosen names. They're chosen reign names. And Yuan means primal or first. It means first, but it really kind of means primal. And that's why they chose that name. They built their capital very far north, farther north than China had ever had. This is an old map. It says Peking here. I haven't seen that name on a map for a long time. But they built their capital and named it Dadu, D-A-D-U, and that will become Beijing, which is the capital now, but they're the first to establish a capital very, very far north, because of course that's where they're from. One of the first things they do, of course, is ban Confucianism, because like other totalitarian leaders, they don't really care for this idea that rulers have any kind of obligation to anyone. They also immediately banned the traditional exams and closed down that academy where you studied Confucius and passed exams, to civil service exams, right, to get into government. All ruling positions were held by the Mongols and their allies, and that to a great extent meant the Tibetans. The Tibetans were close allies with the Mongols from very early on. We've already seen how the Mongols established the position of the Dalai Lama, etc. And if you want to understand this animosity of the Chinese to Tibet, which you see today everywhere, it's a lot deeper than just fearing the Dalai Lama or the political power of the Buddhists. This goes way back. It's a deeply rooted animosity, and it goes back to them being allies of a conquering army, and not treating the Han Chinese very well during this period at all. They were very much out of power. They were rarely in any kind of position of power. The Mongols established themselves as a ruling aristocracy. And as you can see from this map, for the first and last time ever, the entire Silk Road is completely controlled by one political entity. And while some people might sort of intuitively think that the Mongol Empire might have been a disruption to trade, it was quite the opposite. It was a huge boon to trade, because you no longer had to go through dozens and dozens of different political entities that you had to negotiate with to cross their lands, etc. It was now completely controlled by the Mongols and opened wide up, and that's going to be important as well. It'll never be this way again, but right now this is a period of greatest trade. All authority, of course, was with the court. Artists were put in a difficult position. Artists had to decide whether you were going to court artists of the Song. Are you going to go up to Dadu and be a court artist for these, invading foreign rulers, or are you going to be oppositional and take an oppositional stance and go south? Because they're so far north, the best place for the opposition, the safest place, is as far south as you can get. So that north-south split becomes even greater. And we'll talk more about how artists dealt with that as well. The Mongols largely imported artists from Nepal and Tibet. These were allies, and so they didn't really care if court painters didn't work with them, although some really did. Popular subjects for the Mongols, here's the Great Khanate again. We can move on from that. Popular subjects, as you might expect, once again, of course, horses, cavalry, very important, scenes of warfare, etc. This was painted by a court painter named Liu Quando, and he was a favorite painter of Kublai Khan, and it depicts Kublai Khan hunting. One of the things that it's hard for us to see here at all is that this is really a very political image and actually very sort of multicultural. There are figures here identified by their clothing from all of the different khanates. So this image really is about the breadth of the Mongol Empire, the power of the Great Khan. Because while there are different khanates, the Khan that's head of the Great Khan, which is China, is over all the others. So there is one Khan that is higher than all the other Khans in the other khanates, and that's Kublai at this point. So it is meant to show that unification of all the different figures. And they like color, they like movement. It's very dynamic as a style, so very multicultural. very different from subtle sophistication of the Sung. Other scenes they liked, of course, horses, but metaphorical horses. Horses were often used, and this is by Ren Renfa, as you can see, lean and fat horses. These are comments on officials who were in and out of favor. You know, it's a metaphor for like a wise administration. You know, the strong, powerful horses versus the sort of weak, frail horse with his ribs showing. And so they used it in a sense to show them as the strong political force with the healthy horse, and others out of favor, like the Chinese, for example, in the weak horse. Images like this, Zhao Mengfu worked at court for a while. He later left. He's in the late 13th century, so he's painting quite late. No, late 13th century. That's not late. But he actually left the court in Dadu and retired and went south and didn't fare very well. He was considered a traitor when he went south. So working for the Mongol court brings a level of politics into Chinese art that really wasn't there before. And that's going to, as we will see, redefine the role of the literati to a great extent. This is a beautiful hand scroll of figures, and I have a couple of details here. Again, it's sort of metaphorical, where they're, you know, taking care of the horses. You have the Mongol ruler here, who's clearly recognized in the image as such and not Han Chinese. And then he's taking care of his horses. A lot of color, a scene that's very popular in the Yuan dynasty. But more interesting is actually what the literati are doing during this period. And I introduced them with the Sung because that's where they began, but their role is really quite different, because from this period on, they become a genuine oppositional voice in a political as well as aesthetic sense, because they are living under a foreign invader. They still identify themselves in very much the same way. They are people who are highly educated. They reject academic styles now for more than aesthetic reasons. They still focus on brush and ink, or what we call shimo painting. They are independent. That's very important. They're not traders. They embrace the amateur status. And never accept money for their art, though, as I mentioned before, they're quite willing to make trades, trading for influence, trading for other things. So, you know, they're not above, they're not completely sort of uncorrupt as they would like. And I mentioned this briefly, but even more strongly, I want to reiterate how close this stance is to the stance we find in the West in the 20th century, or beginning really in the late 19th century in the West. This idea of an independent artist, you know, someone who's unbeholden, someone who sees themselves as a free thinker, someone rejected by the establishment, loners, and particularly uncorrupted by money and power. I mean, that's a great way to turn a shortfalling into a benefit. It's like, I can't sell my art. Nobody wants it. Therefore, I'm uncorrupted, and power is never going to uncorrupt me. And it's funny because even today, I still hear art students, you know, making these same sort of claims for what they're doing. And I can't help but kind of smile at them, because I know where this is coming from. I don't care if somebody doesn't like my art. I just want to please myself. And, you know, number one, that's not true. Everybody wants to be appreciated. Everybody wants someone to appreciate what they do, but they do enjoy their outsider status. And so they really are, although I've found no one ever using the terminology, I think I'm the only one in the world that thinks of them this way. But to me, they really are an equivalent in some ways to an avant-garde, because they are looking forward to really almost a kind of westernized tradition that will appear in the future. Among the literati, we do see horses. Now, this Gong Kai does this horse, and he's doing it for obvious political reasons. He was an extreme Song loyalist. So this is not meaning the same thing when an artist at court would paint a horse like this. He's actually sort of turning it around and making a comment about the government in power right now. And it's really a comment very much on the Mongols, something he can get away with way down in the South, where he's not being, observed by that many people. So it's sort of on the one hand, a negative comment on the Mongols, but on the other hand, a statement about the plight of the disenfranchised Chinese scholars who are really sort of forced to the South, and in some ways not allowed to sort of travel freely and practice what they do. So it's sort of a twofold metaphor. He was from a very prominent family. In fact, have to at least look at one painting of bamboo because we can't skip it. Bamboo was a major subject both in Chinese painting and somewhat in Japanese, but in China there's a long tradition. It's not a new subject, but it becomes an important subject. Bamboo painters are specialists, and Li Kan is known as the greatest painter of bamboo, hanging scroll on silk, a really beautiful one. He wrote a book on bamboo. He was an amateur botanist as well. He grew it. He understood it. And it's often said, you can't paint bamboo unless you know it, understand it. How does it grow? How do the leaves grow, etc. It was seen, it had a status not unlike calligraphy in a way, because it is about mark making. Bamboo is sort of the perfect form for a brush. If you've ever done any painting, especially watercolor painting, the mark that you see there that is the bamboo leaf is sort of the purest mark of a brush. It's the natural mark a watercolor brush wants to make. When you dip it down, the shape of it's pointed on one end and then becomes wide. It's sort of like the natural statement of a watercolor brush. But it's also symbolic. Bamboo was seen as the symbol of a true gentleman, as calligraphy was as well. It's pliant and yet it's very strong. It gives in the wind, but very, very strong. It's graceful. As I said, it's perfect for the brush. And it's very much about the sort of form and placement of each leaf. Painting bamboo like this, you cannot hide any weaknesses. You can't hide it. Everything would show. That's why it's valued so highly if you can paint it well. As I said, he grew bamboo. He knew everything about it. And as you can see, the subtleties here in terms of the very, very light in the background, the space that he creates with the different values, meaning light and dark, of not only the leaves, but the stems and how they physically relate to one another. This would be certainly part of the sort of lyrical mode, as a kind of revival of a sung sensitivity, very similar to a lyrical painting. And images like this became symbols of opposition because they do harken back to a pure Chinese style, not a style of an invader, but the sort of sensitivity of earlier periods and to a subject from earlier periods. So it becomes political in that way. It's sort of a purist statement of a political belief system, just referencing China's history. Ceramics under the Ying take a turn, a big turn. And in fact, this is where we begin to see the kind of ceramics that most people today associate with Chinese vases. When people think of Chinese ceramics, they tend to think of this blue and whiteware, right? It's the most ubiquitous form of Chinese ceramics. And it begins under the Mongols. It's valued at court. It's made in large quantities. And it's the earliest Chinese ceramics that begin reaching the West, although that's going to take off more later. It's very early, but there are travelers. You know, the Silk Road's wide open, and there are people traveling, and others are beginning to see this. Made at Jingdezhen, the world's greatest center for high quality ceramics, ample forest, great clay, thousands and thousands. It's said that there were at least 10,000 craftsmen working in the South during this period in this region. It truly is an industry by this time. Now, the problem with porcelain all along, as I mentioned before, is that because of the high heat, it's very hard to get colors, intense colors or bright colors. So we got those subtle celadons in porcelain, or maybe that white bowl that we saw. But colors like this, they couldn't do. Well, they now figured out how to do it. Because the Silk Road is open, they began importing cobalt, cobalt blue pigment. It came from Persia, and in fact, in China, the color was known as Mohammedan blue, which to them identified where it was from, the Islamic world in Persia. This cobalt, the nature of it is different. They also developed a new kind of glaze. This is fired in one firing rather than multiple, and you paint this cobalt blue directly on the unfired clay body, and then you cover it with this new kind of glaze. It's a thick, milky white glaze over it, and you fire it at very high temperatures, and in one firing it will turn into porcelain, and at the same time set that beautiful color. So it's for the first time now they know how to do porcelain with color. Now, the biggest difference here, of course, is that this has much less to do with shape and much more to do with surface. They're beginning to think of the surface of the vase as a surface for painting on, but there are still certain scenes and motifs that are specifically for ceramics and not any other type of medium. It's a temple vase. It's one of two that were given as gifts to a temple, or basically a Buddhist monastery. It has these elephant ear handles. Elephants just symbolize strength to a great extent. We have the dragon, the powerful dragon. Dragons we're going to see more of. This is not the imperial dragon. There are a lot of different kinds of dragons, but all dragons symbolize the emperor. But they also sometimes symbolize other things. But this is not the imperial dragon. And we know that because we can count his toes or his claws. He has 4. An imperial dragon has 5. If you ever see a dragon with 5 claws, that belonged to the emperor. It was made for the emperor. It not only symbolizes him, he owned it. This he didn't own. This was made as a gift for a temple. So it's a 4-clawed dragon. And we also see with that dragon, accompanying the dragon, a phoenix. Now the dragon symbolizes the emperor and yin, while the phoenix symbolizes the emperor, yang. The emperor is yang, the male. The phoenix is female and symbolizes the empress, yin. So together they're the yin and yang, the female and the male. And the dragon also symbolizes the qi, or that energy or force that runs through the world, and that's the emperor as well. So we have a lot of the classic symbolism here. You know, it's an interesting shape. It matters. I'm not going to say the shape isn't important, but it's clearly quite different from the emphasis on shape of Sung. This is another example. You know, I've talked several times about the relationship between the surface of a thing, and the mass or form of a thing. We saw it when we were looking at domes, like Islamic domes in India, and I talked about the tiles on the surface and the design and how it took away from the form itself or the sense of mass. Here, the design on the vase draws your attention purely to the surface. And you really almost don't even think. You have to consciously make an effort to think about the shape of the vase, because it's not where your mind goes, it's not where your eye goes. But in the Sung vase, because there is no decoration, you completely focus on that shape and that form. So a new kind of vase that begins under the Mongols, but will continue to be made. Now, if there's one thing we know about the Mongols, and we saw it when we looked at their invasion of India, the Mongols never really cared that much about maintaining an empire. Their goal was always conquest. They rarely stayed around very long or put much effort into, maintaining an empire. That's not what they were about. So they only really were in control for about 100 years or so before, they just stopped caring and started fighting amongst themselves, and basically were overthrown in a revolution. Starting a new dynasty. So they were driven out largely by a revolution of farmers, which happens a lot in China, actually, who chose the name Ming. The first two emperors of the Ming dynasty were not very good. They didn't know what they were doing. They were just farmers, after all. The third emperor really steps in as a powerful emperor and runs an empire. He's the one that moved the capital back to Dadu. The first two had capitals somewhere farther south and in really terrible locations. They were not defensible, and it was really bad. So the third emperor, who's known as the Yongle emperor, moved the capital back. He went back up to Dadu, and he went there on purpose and intentionally built his city on top of the old Mongol Empire capital, symbolically eliminating the Mongols. And that's when Beijing becomes the capital. Now, many people have heard of the Ming Dynasty. I'd be willing to say most people have not heard of any of the others except Ming. It's very well known. So I run into a lot of people that assume the Ming Dynasty is a great golden age in China. It's absolutely not. It's the most repressive era the Chinese ever had, for a number of reasons. Number one, it was an idealization of the past. It was a total hatred and fear of foreigners and intellectuals. They were extremely paranoid. Paranoia always leads to repression of intellectuals or anyone who thinks. It was very authoritarian at court. It was very absolutist in its stance. This is when the Japanese basically just left. Any Japanese that were there and didn't particularly want to travel back there. It's very much a conservative backlash. They're the ones who declared the Sung to be weak. They said, you fell to the Mongols. We captured them back. We're not weak. You were weak. You were you were playing around as sophisticates and intellectuals, and you let the country fall. So we're not going to let that happen anymore. So they were totally despotic. They purged their enemies. It was a bloody time. And quite honestly, the literati fared better under the Mongols than they did the Ming Dynasty, because the Ming Dynasty becomes more aggressive. The Mongols largely, ignored them in the south. They're not ignored anymore. There are severe restrictions placed on them. They couldn't travel at all. And travel was so important for the literati because they did landscape painting and traveled to all these wonderful sites. There was a lot of forced labor used to rebuild the wall. This is where the Great Wall, as we see it today, was built. It was built during this period to keep out those northern foreign invaders. And hundreds of thousands of forced labor used to build that wall, which reconnected a lot of the smaller walls, built them in stone, making them big, strong. Scholars now had even more to think about. This is not a foreign invader anymore. Should I be at court or painting there? But no, or flee to the south. And again, most of them either stayed in the south or fled to the south and then kind of got stuck there because they couldn't travel. Under the Ming, there was no official court Academy of Art, which there had been before. In the North, they set up an academy. They did reestablish the civil service exams, however, for government jobs, but scholars were still very isolated in the South. Because the Silk Road largely collapsed during this period, at least for quite a while, they were not really in contact with the far West at this point, and turned to shipping. So this is really a great age for shipping. This is when they, instead of looking to the Silk Road, they looked to shipping, and turned that way almost completely. Certainly the most important monument of the Ming is the Great Imperial Palace, or the Forbidden City in Beijing, which was quite intentionally designed and laid out over the old capital, as I said before. It's absolutely massive. It's very hard to get a sense of the scale of this, and I know that some of you have been there. It's laid out using the same design and feng shui sensibility that we saw before. Its back is turned to the north. It faces south. And remember, when we looked at landscape painting, I talked about the fact that your back should be to the north and have a hill behind you. So your back is to a hill, and you're facing south. And we'll talk about that. That's going to be important in a minute. Now, the Mongols had designed their city with the northern part of the city, the inner city for themselves, with the Chinese in the south. And the Ming preserved this design, and even within the palace itself, there's a sort of inner palace, which is in the northern section, and outer palace to the side, with the walled, great walled city all the way around it. One thing you notice when you look at this view, aerial view, is this color. It's referred to as imperial yellow. It's a kind of almost an orangish yellow. What you're seeing are these tile roofs. This is the imperial color, and no one else was allowed to use this color for anything. And we're going to see this color in various things at court. The walls themselves, there are 15 miles of walls around this. In fact, there's an inner walled city as well. You can see secondary cities, and a series of tiered gates that you pass through. You also notice the perfect symmetry, which we'll talk about again. It's 240 acres, and it's designed as a microcosm of the universe, with the emperor at the center of the universe, of the world, the center of order and symmetry. I mean, this is, to me, a sort of essential Chinese aesthetic, and it's all rooted in the idea of the imperial system, with the emperor at the center of all things, governing all things, and maintaining order and symmetry. That's the emperor's role. This very famous entrance, which we're going to encounter again, this is actually located out here. This is the walled city. And in front of the walled city are two sort of park areas. And out here, the first gate, which separates Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square is in front of it. It's not in this picture, it's down here. And it's unbelievably huge. Was blown away with the size of it. But the first gate you go through, the most famous, is known as the Tiananmen Gate, or the Gate of Heavenly Peace. It's the one where everybody wants their picture taken, right in front of the picture of Mao, and we're going to see that again as well. And then a sequence of gates and passages that take you more to the sort of inner sanctum. This is really a series of what we call hierarchical spaces, meaning there's a sort of an elite access to the inner spaces. So some people can go through one gate, but you can't pass through the next. So your status and your position determines, the hierarchy of how far you can go into this. This is the Meridian Gate, located right here, a very formal gateway. Really the heart of the ceremonial part of the city. There's a tall platform here you can see. many steps up. And then there are three structures on that platform. The first one right here is the Hall of Supreme Harmony. I love Chinese names for things. The Hall of Supreme Harmony. This is really where his formal throne was placed. These are buildings for formal ceremonies and receptions and the like. Hall of Supreme Harmony here first, you have to go through the gate of Supreme Harmony to get there. And then the smaller in the middle is the Hall of Central Harmony, and then the back building in the back is Hall of Protecting Harmony. So those are the three most important, and they're all ceremonial spaces is what they're for. And then as you go to the back, now we have a smaller walled city that proportionally echoes exactly the larger walled city. So again, you get the important buildings at the back facing forward. And this is the private spaces. This was the emperor and empress lived. And here we have three buildings as well. The front building, which is the largest, which is the Palace of Heavenly Purity. And the back building is the Empress's Palace of Earthly Tranquility. And then I love this, in between them in the middle is the Hall of Union, which is where the emperor and empress would meet. So they have their own realms and one building in between them. And they have beautiful gardens behind there, private gardens, a sort of green area, which is really quite large, is a beautiful gardens in the back. When we look at the whole design, you see the symmetry. Now, directly behind, I mentioned last time that Beijing is flat. Beijing is dead flat. But the problem is Feng Shui says that you must have a hill to your back, a hill or a mountain. So what do? You build a hill behind you. So outside the city, this is outside of the imperial city, built directly in line, is an artificial hill. It's a park now, it's a public park. There are all kinds of wonderful walking paths there. And at the top of that park, right in the middle, on line with all of the buildings, is a Buddhist temple. So now the setting of the imperial palace is perfect. It has its back to the hill in the north, on the north, and it faces south. And this park is really quite lovely. There are, when I was there, our hotel was pretty close to this backside, and a lot of the people some of the people that I went with would go out early in the morning and we'd go walk in this park. And there were primarily senior citizens out there early in the morning walking. The Chinese are very active and they do a lot of exercise and a lot of walking. And there's seniors walking along this park. And one of the things that Chinese do when they're exercising is they shout. They'll just they'll just do that like really loud, top of your lungs. And that's an exercise. It's for your lungs. It's a really good thing to do, shouting really loud, and it strengthens your lungs and gets oxygen in. But it's really scary because you're out there walking and somebody will come up behind you and just scream like right behind you in your ear as loud as they can. And it was very scary the first few times we encountered people shouting in the park. And then you get used to hearing these sounds in the distance of people just shouting. But it's a beautiful place and a beautiful park. So that's Forbidden City. This is the wall that they built. This is when we are shown pictures of what we call the Great Wall, the Chinese call the Ming Wall. That's this, and it's a massive stone structure, obviously built to last. And it reconnected a lot of the smaller walls and rebuilt them. But this is the wall, and this is when it was built, and it's really beautiful. Form, this sort of line. It's like a beautiful line that follows the terrain all along the contours of the earth. So really a beautiful structure. Some of it's in better shape than others. This is in pretty bad shape, but around where the tourist areas were, I didn't see anything like this. What I saw was in better shape, but people crawling all over it everywhere. Beautiful form. And it's a total myth that you could see this from outer space. I'm sure you've heard that. People often say, the Great Wall is the only thing you can see from outer space. It's completely not true. Every astronaut has said that. Plus, if you just stop to think, it's smaller than a highway. If you could see this, you would see every highway, interstate from space. You can't see those. It's ridiculous, but people still keep saying it. It's one of those things that now has legs of its own, and nobody cares whether it's true or not, if they ever really did in the first place. Now, what about painting? Okay, the Ming court is I would say in terms of sophistication, it's pretty much the opposite of the Song. It's a courtly style. It's the most colorful of all courtly art, painted by Yin Hong. It's a beautiful painting. There's a lot of sort of gold and gold leaf. It's a hanging scroll. It's a pretty good size. I don't have the dimensions here, but it's large. And it's hundreds of birds admiring the peacock. Now it taps into, it taps into that bird and flower theme that we saw earlier is popular in Chinese art, but now it's symbolic. We have two peacocks, a peacock and a peahen, who, as you might imagine, are the emperor and empress. And then these would be the other birds or minor officials, etc. And you see the bird here bowing down and paying homage to the empress. So it's very like court art we've seen before, that just sort of validates the importance and role of the emperor and the empress, and it's truly a beautiful piece. Whoops, this is the earlier one we saw. Remember, the Northern Song emperor painted this in the sort of literal style, but I'm just showing it because it's not so much about, the Ming is not so much about literal detail and accuracy, but it's the same theme. It's that flower and bird theme that is so important to everyone. Okay, let's move on. Of course, this is the sort of opulence of the court, but I want to show you one of my favorite Chinese images, which is this portrait of the Ming Hongji emperor, which again is so archetypally Chinese and so imperial. It's such an interesting image. It's very, very powerful image. It's almost like an icon as this figure sits in the middle, steeped in luxury all around him, almost absorbed in this pattern on pattern on pattern, wearing this imperial yellow color. He's the symbol of authority and power, symmetrically placed, perfectly balanced. This is almost bilateral symmetry. Bilateral symmetry is when each side is a mirror image of the other. In fact, it is not all, it's almost bilateral. The screen in the back, of course, is not split in the middle. Of course, we get our dragon back here. Now it's our 5-clawed dragon, because he has 1 claw here and 4 here. So 5-claw, that's the imperial dragon, also known as the heavenly dragon, because remember, the ruler has the mandate of heaven. That goes back to the early Han dynasty. Its imagery is fascinating. It's very flat. It's a very flat image because these forms don't really wrap around his body. Even things like, see these bird images, I assume we're supposed to interpret it as being somehow, say, embroidered on his sleeve, but you see the folds of the sleeve and they don't respond to those folds. They're sitting over the top of the sleeve, perfectly flat. The same way here, where these designs mimic where his legs would be, because his feet stick out right here at the base. It's a very strange image. All around him are the trappings of power. Everything on here is symbolic of power in ways that we may not understand. He's sitting on a huge sort of throne. We have something like that in the Nelson Gallery, in the room where they have the furniture. It has this big a wooden sort of throne-like form. He's staring directly at us, and looking us right in the eye, making it very almost a hypnotic, it really is almost a hypnotic image with all this pattern on pattern on pattern. And really quite beautiful. There's no modeling on his face. His face just stands out in the midst of all of this swirling hypnotic design. And the face is absolutely there. It's a very traditional way of showing the emperor. And there are many like that. Is this a portrait of that emperor? I'm not sure how accurate it is. It may very well be close. It's quite different from the scroll of the emperors that we saw, a very early one where the emperor was shown, they all looked alike. There were 13 past emperors. They were all kind of identical. He does still seem to have some girth here. There's a sort of a suggestion that he's large and powerful, but it may or may not look like him. It's kind of hard to tell. Now, what's happening to the literati while the Ming are in charge? Now, they had been politically oppositional. Someone had their hands up, but I just saw a hand for a second and then it disappeared. Somebody have a question? I can't hear.
Not now.
Oh, okay. I might miss the hand, but if you'll say something, then I'll hear you and you'll jump forward on the screen so then I can see you as well. So anyway, jump in. The literati were politically oppositional in the Yuan, and they are still politically oppositional because they are being repressed. I want to look at a painting that is part of an album of 6 images. 5 of them are by Shenzhou. 1 is by another artist. These have been mounted. It's really kind of hard to know how these have been mounted. What I've read says they've been mounted as a hand scroll. I don't think it means they've been mounted like this. I think this is just an image of the 6 of them. I think possibly they were mounted end to end on a hand scroll. But, and by the way, these are all in the Nelson Gallery and they are not on display. And when I found out that this Shenzhou was in the Nelson, I was so excited because I love this piece. And so the first time I went there after I moved here and started looking for it, I was very disappointed because they have some beautiful scrolls. None of them are on view. And I don't want to presume to know why that is the case, but we're going to look at this one by Shenzhou. Absolutely beautiful and very different, very unusual. He is a master of the Ming literati painting. It's modeled on earlier literati styles going back to the Sung and even literati of the Yuan period. It's very, very strong poetic and literary flavor, more so than any others before. He was from a very prominent family, never did take a career. He had enough money that he could pursue writing his poetry and his painting. And he studied the past and developed this interesting eclectic style. Now, poet on a mountain. What we have here written is in this colophon, remember they're called colophon editions, is a poem, his poem. And for the first time, this poem actually plays a physical and visual role in the actual painting. It's not something that's just written on there for interest. This poet up here is actually looking at this writing as if it's in the sky in front of him, as if he's literally reading this poem. And that's an important part of it. We saw earlier work in which we have people in a landscape. And remember this Fan Quan, where there are tiny little people down here on the road in this massive landscape. And you could almost overlook the people. I mean, they were there and they do play a role. However, they aren't that important. In the Shenzhou, that little figure, while he's still small, is key. That's where your eye goes. This is about him. And about his travels. He is this sort of poet who's not on the road as much as he would like to be. It's very much about the traveling scholar and the experience of the traveling scholar artist. It's about traveling, departure. It's about reflection on those travels. It's about sociability, separation, the difficult life of the literati. Now the poem, and I'm sure there are different translations, the translation I have, it says, white clouds encircle the mountain waste like a sash. Stone steps mount high into the void where the narrow path leads far. Alone, leaning on my rustic staff, I gaze idly into the distance. My longing for the notes of a flute is answered in the murmurings of the gorge. Now, several things strike me when I hear that poem. First of all, it's written in the first person. It's about what this man is experiencing at this exact moment. Now, we haven't seen anything like that in Chinese art thus far. And it's very much about, it's almost a stream of consciousness as he's describing his experience, what it feels like, what he's seeing, what he hears, and how he feels about that, and his longing. There's a sense of loss and a sense of longing that relates very directly to this moment in time when the literati are not able to travel. Stylistically, it's really a mixture of interesting styles. It's not the finicky little detail of calligraphic marks that we saw in the earlier Fan Quan. There's some larger marks here, some things that are just big washes. It's a mixture of different visual languages in a way, because you've got just sort of clear washes that are misty here. You've got things that are more three-dimensionally depicted, things that are almost sort of translucent. This wonderful suggestion down here of mist that suggests a river running around, and he talks about the murmuring of the gorge, meaning the water that's down there that he hears. You can see that it was unfortunately folded at some point. They all have this sort of fold in the middle, but it really is a kind of culmination of Chinese literati styles, taking from the Sung, from the Yuan literati and others. A beautiful piece, and I will remind you of this more later. So very unusual in its power and its sort of personal expression, which is not something we're used to. We're going to see that more in later periods, but it's very early to have that kind of personal expression. A really beautiful piece. And I love the way the poem plays a visual role. You swear he's looking at it, that he's reading it, like it's hanging in the sky. And none of the other sort of colophons that we've seen really have that characteristic. They feel like they're sort of additions and not really part of the actual imagery itself. Now, back this up. At the same time that he is working, or roughly around this period, a Chinese painter and calligrapher named Dong Zichang, or just Dong, wrote a book called Talking of Painting. And in this book, he is the first art history book, or the first book where someone tries to write a history of Chinese painting. And he identified two schools, what he called the Northern School and the Southern School. Basically, what he was doing is describing courtly art of the North, which he clearly saw as inferior because it was gaudy and colorful and all of that, versus the Southern School, which is basically the literati, which is largely the ink wash. But Dong is also known for his studies of calligraphy and calligraphic styles. And this fascination with earlier periods and studying earlier periods is definitely something that we see both in the painting of the Ming literati and also in the calligraphy of the period. And I just want to roughly show you some different kind of scripts as Dong outlined them. Now, all of this calligraphy is actually Dong. So he's taking earlier styles and then reinterpreting them. This is what artists were supposed to do. He's intentionally sort of using archaic styles that would reference Han or earlier periods, because the goal was to, in a sense, look at the past, use the past, look at a former artist style, and then transform it yourself. So looking at one painter's work and then transforming that with your own voice. That was really the goal of painting, which is why we see, similar styles through time, because this is what they're doing. But the same thing is done in calligraphy. These are earlier styles. This is part of what's called the regular script at that time anyway. The graphs are full, complete, they're clear, they're quite regimented, they're quite orderly. The pace is very steady and even. It doesn't appear like you speed it up here and then slowed down here. The sizes are very consistent. The ink is applied in a consistent way. The one is called the Stone Classics. Remember, we talked about the Stone Classics. This one is when something is like carved onto a stone. They would use this script, something very regular and very readable. Cursive script, which is sort of just the opposite. These are Dungs as well, interpreting earlier periods of cursive script. They're very, very simple, very rapid. They often eliminate strokes or parts of ideograms. Sometimes they connect one stroke to another, which is sort of why it's called cursive. This was very popular for a gentleman's sort of personal correspondence, and it became increasingly acceptable for more formal purposes as well. There's a lot of variation in personal styles. The wild cursive, how anybody could read that, I can't even imagine. Of course, I couldn't read it, if it were printed in a regular format, but it's hard to even see anything there. This is a little more regular. Can you read this, Angie?
Can't read it. I mean, I might be able to pick out. No, I can't pick out anything. I never could pick out and read grass script. It just confounded me.
It's beautiful.
Very beautiful.
It's very beautiful. And I love the wild cursive. I mean, that's just over the top.
Angie, I've got a question. You call that grass script?
Yeah, the one on the left is called a cursive grass script.
Oh, I see. Yeah, it's titled.
I'm not sure why.
Interesting name for it.
This is just a couple of examples. There were many, many, many. People would have their own different artists would invent their own versions and name them. So there are a great many, but the grass script is fairly well known. So is the wild cursive. There are a great many of them. I mean, they really are like an art form. So they're going to be very personal. The so-called semi-cursive or running script is sort of in between the two. It's not quite as regimented as the first, but more readable. Dance of the Brush, isn't that a wonderful name? I love that. These also have some abbreviations, some shortcuts, but they're more complete. They're closer to the regular script, and also many, many variations. So Dung was very famous not only for his studies then of the history of art or painting, but also the history of calligraphy. And you can see how his own reinterpretations were important. Ming ceramics continue what was begun in the Yuan. These two vases, which are really very precious, are in the Nelson Gallery. These are imperial vases, imperial dragons. You can see his 5 claws there in both of them. One of them's damaged. There's quite a bit of damage there, but these are in a case in the hallway up there on the Asian section. But it's the same blue and white, cobalt underglaze, the same techniques from the Yuan. Today, when people see blue and white ware, it's usually associated with Ming. Most of them are, simply because it's a later period. The older the vase, the fewer you're going to have of them. But it really isn't an invention of the Ming. It's an invention of the Yuan, and it was popular. I have to show you my favorite, however, and that is the chicken cup. This is absolutely stunning. There are only 19 genuine chicken cups in existence. It comes from the imperial kiln. It is porcelain, very silky texture. You can sort of see the glaze. You can see the several colors here. There's a technique being used here now that is a little more advanced than just the underglaze technique. It's called an overglaze. First, they would paint the cobalt blue on the unfired clay body, and then the milky glaze over it, and then fire it at high temperature so that you have porcelain. Then they would go back in with enamel, and enamel is basically a kind of liquid glass color, and that's where you'd paint on the red or greens or other colors, and then fire it a second time at a very low temperature to lock in those enamels. So this is a new technique, and it allows multiple colors, and they're going to continue doing this now, this technique. Now, why I'm showing you the chicken cup, because it is really cute, but this particular chicken cup was sold in 2014 to a Chinese collector from Shanghai for, wait for it, $36.3 million. Let me repeat that, $36.3 million for this chicken cup. Obviously, that's some kind of a record, but yet they actually expected more for it. The expected price was a lot more. Now, it caused a huge controversy in China because the purchaser had a picture of himself that was on social media sipping tea from this cup, and it caused a huge uproar in China. The images were all over the internet. Now, the people were not at all upset by the amount of money he paid for. In the West, that's what people would be concerned with, is the amount of money. But in China, they commented on many things. Here's what one of them said in a comment: "You think you can drink from it and become immortal, or that it will extend your life? In fact, isn't it just a way to satisfy your vanity?" They were concerned because he drank out of it. That was the problem, because this was an imperial cup, and it probably had associations with it, linking it to the emperor. And that a private person would drink from this cup was an outrage. Just different ways of thinking about these things. It is a beautiful little cup, but I couldn't help telling you, I don't usually talk about economics when I'm talking about the history of art, but sometimes there are some things you just kind of have to comment on. And that's the chicken cup. I would be willing to bet, I used to say this to my students, and I swear it's true. I could go back up and look at a student who had this course 15 years ago, and I'll bet you the one thing they remember is the chicken cup. I would be willing to bet just about anything that they do remember the chicken cup. It's very disheartening as a teacher. Speaking of opulence and luxury, I do want to show you one example of another kind of Ming luxury good, because the Ming court was steeped in opulence and steeped in luxury. And another Chinese luxury good were beautiful lacquered objects or furniture. In fact, these are lacquer trees. Lacquer comes from the sap of a lacquer bush or a lacquer tree. It's a resin, and it's nothing new. In fact, lacquered objects, they typically lacquer something that is wood because it protects it. It's like it's a protective layer over wood, and it's soft, so you can carve into it. And there are lacquered objects going back to the Neolithic period in China. It's very, very ancient, usually just functional or practical, but it became a luxury good item in the Ming. Here's a beautiful little carved box. So it's a little wooden box covered in this beautiful cinnabar colored lacquer, and then carved into, it's a very Ming style of carving. You can see how it was resin, sort of soft and pliable. There's something very sensual about lacquer until it becomes really hard. And there's sort of a curve, the curved surfaces of the leaves. They're not sharp edges, they're very rounded. That's very much a Ming style. But you'll see furniture covered in lacquer, boxes, small things, any sort of thing can be covered in lacquer. Now the Ming will eventually decline when they are invaded themselves. The Great Wall that they built to the north didn't really help them. The wall isn't going to help you if somebody on your side opens the door for the enemy, which is what happened. I don't go into it, but a Ming general aided in this. There was a lot of political decline. This is what always happens at the end of a dynasty: inattentive emperors, factions, different rebellions. But people from the north, actually the descendants of the same Jurchen people who came down and captured the northern Song. These are the same people a few generations later. Manchu, people from Manchuria, the Manchu, came down as foreign invaders and captured Beijing in the north. That's the bad part about having your capital in the north. Invaders from the north can get to it. It was very bloody. Tens of thousands of people were slaughtered, and they controlled China for almost 300 years in the form of the Qing, the very last Chinese dynasty, the Qing dynasty. As you can see in the map, it's much closer to modern China than anything we've seen before. It's a Manchu dynasty. Chinese will never have self-rule again, well, for short periods. It was a period of, unlike the Mongols, who were barely there 100 years, the Manchus were there like 300, but it's a very different sort of empire. The Mongols never attempted to become Chinese. They never cared about merging cultures. They were not a Sinicized people. Sinicized means to become Chinese, to embrace the culture. And Manchus became Chinese. They were Sinicized even before they attacked. They wanted to be Chinese. That's why they came in and captured China. So they embrace it. In fact, they embrace Chinese culture as only a convert would, and they became almost more Chinese than the Chinese, the Manchus. They made a lot of changes. They opened up. They were more open, more liberal than the Ming dynasty rulers. They opened up trade with India, Malaysia, Japan, Europe, South America, through the Philippines, east. They also, by the 17th century, opened the doors to a lot of Europeans, particularly Jesuits. There were a lot of Jesuits at the Chinese court by the 17th century. The Portuguese had arrived earlier. We know the Portuguese were the first ones everywhere. They were the first ones in Africa, the first Europeans in India. They're the first in China, but they never really stay anywhere and have a real presence. But the Qing court is an interesting one. This is a painting by Lang Shi-ning, and Lang Shi-ning has another name, and that name is Giuseppe Castiglione. Now, as you might guess, Lang Shi-ning is Italian, and he was there as part of the sort of Italian retinue of Jesuit priests. He wasn't a priest, but he had a job. He was the liaison between the imperial court and the Jesuits in China. He understood the language. He was also a painter and was a very popular painter with the Qing court during this period. They loved his style because it was somewhat exotic to Chinese eyes, because it had certain Western qualities. It's a kind of a merging of Eastern and Western styles. And in this piece of a hand scroll, you see it in things like this horse. This horse is modeled in a Western way. And when I say modeled, that means making it look three-dimensional with shadows and highlights, which is something that Chinese art did not do. And you can see there are shadows here that make this rump look rounded, and shadows here and highlights here, things like that. Not so much on the white horse. They didn't like it because one of the problems they had was shading. The Chinese always thought that shading made something look like it was dirty, like there's a smudge on you. You know, if you put a shadow on someone's face, they saw it as a dirty face, where we would just read it as a shadow. They weren't used to reading it that way. You know, you learn how to read things. Reading is something you learn, and you read works of art. You learn how to interpret what you're seeing. And so the white horse would just look like a dirty horse if they put shadows on here. But because it's dark, they could put the shadows on it, and they were able to sort of see it as not being a dirty horse. So, you know, the people's faces aren't going to have shadows on them because they would just look dirty. But very popular for this, you know, also sort of an excerpt, very different, very Western here. This, not only the angle that he shows the horse, but the shading of the horse, the roundedness, there's a physicality there, while at the same time, it's not really a Western horse either, because there's no ground line, he's not standing on anything, there's no background, there's no space around it. And also the head is very small. If a European artist painted a horse like this, he would actually exaggerate the head and make it bigger than it should be. Because of foreshortening, something closer to you is bigger, so you exaggerate the close side and make it even bigger than it actually would be. By not doing that, he creates a strange, it looks like super tiny to our eye, because we're used to reading foreshortening. And so our eye tells us something else entirely. And definitely this was interpreted as exotic. I find that interesting because Asian art imported into the West was interpreted in the West as exotic. You know, people see the foreign as exotic. So in this case, plain old European art is exotic in ways that it wouldn't have been in the West. But my favorite of all of his paintings is this contribution to a scroll. This is a part of a much larger hand scroll. It's known as the Inauguration Portraits, or Mind Picture of a Well-Governed and Tranquil Reign. I love that title too. It's an image of 13 portraits of former emperors and or with their empresses. 3 of them, the first 3 on the scroll, are by him. All the others are by Chinese artists. And so these are the exotic ones right at the beginning. And I think these are just beautiful, but they're also Westernized in some way. First of all, the fact that they are busts. They are from the chest up. That's a Western thing. That was never done in China. In China, you did the full figure. It's a focus on the face that you didn't see in China, because it's in the West where true portraiture exists, where you focus on the face. You know, busts we associate in the West with like Roman portrait busts. They were the first to use the bust format because they were interested in the portrait of the face, what a unique person looked like. And these are clearly portraits of specific people. At the same time, however, they're wearing the traditional trappings of power, the imperial yellow, there are imperial dragons everywhere. If you look closely at the face, there is a suggestion of modeling here. There's a bit of shadow that rounds the face. There's a bit of shadow here around the eyes, along the nose, under the chin, just minimal so that they don't look like they have too dirty a face, but he's given them a bit of that, which is what they loved. I love this comparison to the Ming emperor. Of course, we have the full figure, all of the trappings of power and color exaggerated, really quite abstractly, and the completely flat face with no modeling, staring eyes. This guy is still symmetrical, frontal, so he's in your face, but he's not as scary. You know, he's not as frightening because there's a bit of a a smile. There's a sense of a, smiling with your eyes thing that we talk about, which has to do with the way his eyebrows, smiling with your eyes has nothing to do with your eyes. It's all about your eyebrows, where your eyebrows are. That's what tells people whether you're truly smiling or not. And they're elevated. See how they're pulled up just a bit? That makes you read this as a bit of a smile, slightly relaxed and less of an off-putting figure than the very aggressive figure. It's sort of a balancing softness with aggression. Now, what happens with the Qing? Okay, what happens with the literati during this period? The Manchus were so obsessed with everything Chinese that the Manchu court in Beijing embraced what they saw as Chinese, and that was, to a great extent, literati art. The court collected ink wash paintings. That was Chinese to them. Some of them were even painters. Some of the Manchu emperors were even painters, and they painted in ink wash, which is really great, except what happens to the literati? Because the traditional oppositional voice in the South, you've now usurped their style. The foreign invader has usurped what used to be a politically oppositional style. So what can I do? So what had once been the style of reclusive scholars set against the colorful and gaudy court style is now the style of the court itself. So how do we be oppositional? And they did this by becoming what is known as the individualists. There's no literati in the Qing dynasty because the Qing took that power away from them. So the mere use of ink wash is not only not oppositional, that's catering to a foreign invader's style. So we got to do something different. So they become what we call individualists. And the individualists, and I love the individualists, they're Chinese loyalists, they're loyal to the Chinese, they're oppositional to the Manchu government, which is in fact at this point a very dangerous stance to take. Many artists actually retired or went to live in monasteries rather than paint at all because of how dangerous it was to be an individualist during this period. And there isn't one style that's an individualist. That's kind of the point. They're individualists. Shitao is one of my favorites. This is an incredible painting that is still connected to a Chinese tradition in its subject, mountains, little buildings or monasteries or whatever out in the countryside. And yet it's totally unrecognizable within the literati context. It's number one, colorful. He's experimenting and taking all sorts of chances with his forms, the way he's using line, the way he's layering it with these sort of splashes of color, which are not being limited by the line at all. They're breaking free entirely from line. So they're not just describing the mountains. It's really quite beautiful. And again, I have to say, it reminds me very much of something more Japanese than Chinese in a number of ways. In this landscape, an album leaf, you can't even always tell what you're reading. Are there trees here? As some people said, that looks like a tree, but it's upside down. There is an inscription on the back of this loose leaf that says that he made this for a friend, and a friend sent him some paper and requested a painting. I just think that's such an interesting idea, to give an artist all the supplies and then ask them to make you something with those supplies. That's an interesting idea. Color is used here to perhaps suggest atmosphere, perhaps mist rising. We can't tell. It's very intuitive, kind of eccentric, very spontaneous as well. Wonderful textures. I love the textures and the patterns. He also actually wrote a book about painting, but my But like an interesting comparison to the Ming literati. It's really quite different, and yet, somewhat similar theme, and yet approaching it in a totally unique way. Couldn't work like Shenzhou anymore. That's not going to be possible because of the new associations with that style, with that technique. My favorite of the independents or the individualists is this Ren Qiang incredible hanging scroll. This is life size. So imagine, that's his about his size, completely unprecedented in a great many ways. Unprecedented in the fact that, number one, it's a self-portrait. Chinese painters don't make self-portraits. For one thing, look at the date. We're up to the 19th century now. The Qing will continue into the 20th century. They are the last Chinese dynasty. Now we're into the 19th century. There is, without a doubt, Western influence happening here. Most particularly, also see a lot of influence from prints, color prints, color woodblock prints. And we're going to talk more about printmaking when we get to Japan, because that's where color printmaking really takes off. Just this idea of the self-portrait tells me Western influence here, because it's not an Asian concept in any way. So he shows himself standing here in this beautiful design where, again, he's speaking two visual languages here. Actually, I see three languages being spoken here. I see all of his garments is one visual language. It's a language of flatness, angularity, sharp line, black line and outline, which is what connects it to printmaking, as we will see later. And then when he comes to his body, he's speaking a completely different language. Now it's warm tones, model, light shading here, modeling the form. They don't go together at all. They don't exist in the same world. They're two different visual languages. They can't exist together, and yet they do. And then this text is a third language. I love the way his hands, which are sort of overlaid, they're almost like being absorbed in this flat, angular world. They're not like the rest of his body. This text also, well, we're used to seeing colophons like this on Chinese painting. Maybe it's a poem. No, it's not. It's also very individualist. I think the closest description is it's like a diary entry. It's him speaking his very personal feelings about the world. This is a man who saw a world in turmoil, and his world was in turmoil. This is taking place during the Taiping Rebellion, which was a very important event happening in China. It lasted from 51 to 64, and it was a rebellion started in the South with peasants, but they raised quite a large army. It was, in fact, an attempt to overthrow the empire and form a socialist government. This is China's first socialist revolution. The Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. France had its own attempt to establish a socialist government in 1848. Everyone's socialist writings are everywhere in the 19th century, in France as early as the 1830s, but the second half of the 19th century, socialist ideas are everywhere. This was China's first attempt. They actually captured a lot of Chinese cities, but they were finally put down by the imperial government with the help of Britain, with the help of the British and the French armies, helped them put down the Taiping Rebellion. But it was chaos in the Chinese countryside, and he's sort of living in the middle of that. But he's also talking about his life. He feels like he's a personal failure. He hasn't accomplished anything, and it's very unusual in how personal it is. We've seen a couple of examples of people, even in Shenzhou's, the poet on the mountain, he was speaking in first person, telling about how that one person felt. This is an artist telling how I feel, not how some character I invented in a picture feels, but he's speaking powerfully through a self-portrait. And it's a beautiful piece. It's a powerful piece. He's managed to get a sense of angst in it, a sense of almost melancholy in the face, and it's almost a tormented soul. It's a very powerful image, and I truly love it. Brief look at the ceramics, and then we're really done with well, not, yeah, then we're done with the Qing. We just have a few follow-ups to do. You know, this multicolored technique that they had developed using 2 firings, doing 1 firing with the cobalt underglaze to create the porcelain, and then painting on with enamel, and then doing a 2nd firing at a very low temperature. Now that's common. And these sorts of things are being turned out in large number, a lot of it for export. This stuff's going to Europe. By the 18th century, Europeans love this. The other thing I would point out is not only is this vessel all about the surface, it's not even the same typical subjects we saw on the earlier vases. These are the same subjects that would have appeared on a scroll. You know, if it's something that would have been on a hand scroll, now it's painted on a piece of ceramic. So totally different subjects, not unique to ceramics at all. Very popular, and images like this is so beautiful because of those colors. And those enameling, all this is enameling, most of that's enameling. This is the sort of thing that entering Europe in the 18th century had a huge impact on Rococo art in France, the development of Rococo, which was very sort of busy and floral and complicated, is very influenced by these Chinese forms. I have just a handful of Chinese things to look at. What I'll do next time is I want to talk about the revolution, the Republic of China, the development of the People's Republic of China, and look at what happens in art in those periods, as well as the Maoist period and the post-Maoist period. That won't take long. I just want to look at a couple of examples of each, and then we're ready to start looking at Southeast Asia. And I don't have a lot for Southeast Asia, so it's entirely possible that I might even be able to start Japan next time. We'll see. So I'll send out everything you need before next week. So does anybody have questions or comments about today? Yeah, Carol?
So on the writing, on the calligraphy, do you normally read right to left or up and down? The grass seem to read up and down.
They all read up and down.
Right to left, up and down,
Yeah.
for the old stuff. But now they've changed it to read just the way we read.
Really?
Yeah. So if you get a book in Chinese, a contemporary book, it'll be left to right.
And not in columns, in rows.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this would be start in the upper right and read down, and then read each row down. Interesting.
Kind of versatile of them.
Well, they just kind of changed with the times.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't think of any other language that has done that, though. I mean, can you?
They're doing that with names as well, where, you know, traditionally, you know, the first name we see is the family name followed by their individual name. That's true in all of Asia, but artists working today don't do that. They'll just do it the Western way, reverse their names and assume. But that makes it more confusing for people who know the reversal. Now, did you already reverse? With Japanese names, it's not hard to tell because there's a big difference between first the family name and the individual name in Japanese. They're really quite distinct. You can usually tell which is which. I'm not always as sure with Chinese names, but all of this historical stuff, it always begins with a family name.
Yeah.
Which is far more logical. I wish we would do that because it makes much more sense to hit, because we always have to reverse it to alphabetize, right? You always have to put your family name and then comma in your first name to alphabetize. Well, they never have to do that because they start with the family name. So,
well, my current friends, I call them by their last name.
Yeah.
You know, Shang of Shang Tea Company
Yeah.
His actual full name is Shang Zihua. Zihua is his first name.
Right.
Last name is Shang, so it's Shang Zihua.
How do they refer to each other?
Oh, the same way. And sometimes they'll just say the whole name. Like for me, my Chinese name is Jinan Qi, and that's the way they would call me. They would call me Jinan Qi. They wouldn't call me Anqi. They wouldn't call me Jean. They would call me Jinan Qi. So they just say the whole thing. And Jean is my last name. Anqi. Anyway, yeah.
All of the Chinese, the people that we met in China, as well as, I mean, we had a lot of people from China on our campus as well, because we had kind of like an exchange thing. They all adopted Western names. That was just standard. They didn't even try and get you. They all had names, but they were always like really odd, old-fashioned names that they would adopt. So they all had, in fact, I just taught a class like a few weeks ago online for JCCC, and one of my students had a Chinese name, and the first thing she said is, you know, her name is Ivy, and that's it. They Westernize, they choose a Western name, and that's all they want to be known by, rather than let us mangle their name. It's probably easier for them to just pick a Western name we can handle. And they all have them in China. Everybody we met just gave us the Western name.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments or anything? Well, if not, then I will see everybody next week, and we'll wrap up China and start on some new things. I can't wait to get to Japan. That's always fun. See everybody next week.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.